My name is Caroline, 34 years old, and right now I'm packing the last photo of my husband Mark from our bedroom dresser. His mother just served me eviction papers 3 weeks after we buried him, giving me 24 hours to leave the home we shared for 8 years. She thinks she's won that throwing me out will erase my existence from their family story. But Mark told me something before he died. Something his family doesn't know I possess. Before I tell you how I turned their cruelty into their complete downfall, let me know where you're watching from. Please subscribe if you believe karma always finds its way back to those who deserve it. I met Mark at a charity gala in Boston 7 years ago. I was there as a volunteer nurse, checking blood pressure for donors, while he was the reluctant attendee his mother Patricia had dragged along. He kept finding excuses to come back to my station, pretending he felt dizzy, asking questions about heart health that became increasingly ridiculous. By his fifth visit, I was laughing so hard I could barely hold the blood pressure cuff steady. That laugh made him finally ask for my number. Mark came from old Boston money, the kind that had streets named after them. His great-grandfather built a real estate empire that his grandmother expanded into commercial properties across New England. When Mark's father died of a heart attack at 52, Patricia took control of everything. She ruled that family with perfectly manicured iron fists, keeping Mark's older brother James and younger sister Emma in line through a combination of money and manipulation. James was already a partner at a prestigious law firm downtown, the kind of place where they had marble floors and paintings worth more than I made in 5 years. Emma never worked a day in her life, floating from charity lunch to spa appointment, living off her trust fund and whatever additional money Patricia slipped her for maintaining the family image. Mark was different, though. He'd started his own tech company, refused most of the family money, and that independence drove Patricia crazy. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, the kind of place his family would never set foot in, because it didn't require reservations 6 months in advance. Mark told me later that he knew he loved me when I ordered 2 desserts, because I couldn't decide between tiramisu and cannoli. He said anyone who embraced joy that freely was someone he wanted in his life forever. Patricia hated me from the moment Mark introduced us. I was a nurse from Worcester, my father worked construction, my mother was a teacher. I didn't summer in the Hamptons or winter in Aspen. I didn't know which fork to use for the fish course. At our first family dinner, she spent the entire evening asking pointed questions about my education, my family's background, whether I planned to continue working after marriage. That last question made Mark's jaw clench so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. We got married 2 years after meeting in a small ceremony at the public garden. Mark wanted to elope completely, but I convinced him to at least invite his family. Only his cousin Tony came a black sheep like Mark, who'd become a social worker instead of joining the family business. Patricia claimed she had a scheduling conflict, James was supposedly in depositions, and Emma said she had food poisoning. We both knew they were lying, but Mark held my hand and said their absence was a gift. The first mistake we made was moving into Mark's childhood home in Beacon Hill. It was a beautiful brownstone his grandmother had left specifically to him, not the family trust. Patricia had been livid about that detail in the will, but she couldn't contest it. She suggested we live there temporarily while looking for something more suitable for starting a family. I should have known then that she had plans. Living there meant Patricia had keys, which she used liberally. I'd come home from 12-hour shifts at Mass General to find her rearranging our furniture, replacing my comfortable couch with something that looked beautiful, but felt like sitting on concrete. She'd go through our mail, commenting on our credit card statements, questioning every purchase that wasn't from the right kind of store. Mark would confront her. She'd cry about just wanting to help, and the cycle would continue. My nursing career was a constant source of her disdain. She'd introduce me at events as Mark's wife, period, never mentioning my work as head of the cardiac unit. When I received an award for patient care excellence, she scheduled a family dinner the same night, claiming she'd forgotten. She'd make comments about how exhausting my work must be, how it aged people prematurely always, while examining my face like she was cataloguing wrinkles. Mark defended me fiercely, which only made things worse. Every time he stood up to her, she'd find new ways to punish us both. Suddenly, Mark's trust fund distributions would be delayed due to administrative issues. Family business opportunities would go to James instead. Emma would accidentally spill red wine on my dress at events. It was psychological warfare disguised as accidents and oversight. The first 5 years of our marriage were still beautiful, despite his family. Mark's tech company developed an app that revolutionized how hospitals manage patient data, and he sold it for enough money that we never needed his family's wealth. I was promoted to head nurse of the cardiac unit, the youngest person ever to hold that position. We traveled to places his family would never go, like camping in national parks and volunteering in clinics in Guatemala. We built a life completely separate from them. Then came our struggle with infertility. 3 years of trying 4 rounds of IVF, 2 miscarriages that shattered us. Mark held me through every negative test, every loss, every hormone injection that made me feel like I wasn't myself anymore. He never once made me feel like I was failing him, even when Patricia started making comments about the importance of continuing the family line. Patricia was cruel about our infertility in that subtle way only she could manage. She'd send articles about adoption, always emphasizing how wonderful it was for people who couldn't have their own children. She'd mention Emma's friend, who used a surrogate, wondering aloud if perhaps the problem wasn't Mark. At Christmas, she gave us a donation in our name to a children's charity, saying she knew how much we cared about kids we'd never have. 2 years ago, everything changed when Mark collapsed during a morning run. The diagnosis was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the same genetic condition that killed his father. The doctors said he'd probably had it his whole life, but stress and age were making it worse. He needed surgery medications, complete lifestyle changes. The man who ran marathons suddenly couldn't climb stairs without stopping to rest. Patricia's behavior shifted when Mark got sick, but not in the way you'd expect from a mother. She started visiting more often, but always with James. Always with papers for Mark to sign. Family business documents, she said, things that needed to be handled in case something happened. Mark was suspicious, but too tired to fight. He'd sign whatever they put in front of him just to make them leave so he could rest. 6 months ago, Mark's condition deteriorated rapidly. His heart was failing, the medications weren't working anymore, and he was in and out of the hospital constantly. I took family medical leave from work to care for him. Patricia suddenly started appearing daily, bringing food. We couldn't eat flowers that triggered Mark's new allergies, always accompanied by either James or Emma, who would wander through the house like they were taking inventory. One night, Mark woke me up at 3 in the morning, more lucid than he'd been in weeks. He said he needed to tell me something important. His family was stealing from the estate, had been for years. James was using his position as family lawyer to hide assets, move money offshore, avoid taxes. Patricia had been embezzling from his grandmother's trust. Emma's expensive lifestyle was funded by fraudulent insurance claims and false charity donations. Mark had discovered it all accidentally when he was looking through old papers in the study, trying to understand his grandmother's original will. He found discrepancies, properties that should have been sold, but were somehow still generating rent for Patricia charity organizations that didn't exist, but received huge donations that were tax write-offs. The house we lived in was never properly transferred to him. Patricia had just assumed control and let him live there. He'd been working with his friend David, a lawyer from his Harvard days, who specialized in estate law. They'd been gathering evidence for months, recording conversation where James discussed moving money, documenting Patricia's forgeries on property transfers. Mark showed me where he'd hidden everything, a safety deposit box at a bank Patricia didn't know about, registered only in my name. The key was hidden inside a hollowed-out medical textbook on our shelf, one of mine from nursing school that Patricia would never touch. Inside the safety deposit box was everything USB drives with recordings. Original documents, his grandmother's real will, that Patricia had hidden proof that the house was meant to be held in trust for Mark's children, or if he had none for charitable purposes, that Patricia had been blocking. Mark made me promise to only use it if they came after me. He knew they could see it in how they looked at me when they thought he was sleeping. He'd already created a new will with David, one that left everything to me. But he told David to wait to file it until after he died, to let his family think the old will was still valid. It was a trap, and they would walk right into it. His final week was spent gathering the family for what he called an important announcement. He wanted to tell them he knew everything, wanted to give them a chance to make it right. But the stress was too much. He collapsed before he could say anything, and we rushed him to the hospital. The doctors said his heart was failing completely. There was nothing more they could do. Those last hours in the hospital, Mark held my hand and made me promise to be strong. He said he'd spent years feeling guilty about his family's behavior toward me, but now he was giving me the power to finally fight back. His last words were about how I'd taught him what real love looked like, not the conditional, transactional thing his family called love, but the kind that stayed through IVF failures and cardiac units and hospital beds. He died at sunrise, my hand in his, finally at peace. Patricia took over the funeral arrangements before Mark's body was even cold. She arrived at the hospital with James, who had papers for me to sign, claiming they were standard procedures for releasing the body to the funeral home. I was too grief-stricken to read them carefully, but something made me hesitate. I told them I needed time to process, that I'd handle things through the funeral home directly. Patricia's face tightened, but she couldn't argue with a grieving widow in front of the nurses who were my colleagues. The funeral was everything Mark would have hated. Patricia turned it into a society event at the most expensive funeral home in Boston, with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had the programs printed with the family crest, listing all the family achievements, but barely mentioning Mark's company or our marriage. I was listed as surviving spouse in small print at the bottom like a footnote. She told the funeral director I was too distraught to speak at the service, which was a lie. I'd written a speech about Mark's kindness, his volunteer work, the way he'd light up when talking about making healthcare accessible through technology. Instead, James gave a cold eulogy about family legacy and responsibility. Emma read a generic poem she'd found online. Patricia spoke about losing her baby boy, the son she'd barely visited during his final months until she needed signatures. During the reception, I overheard Emma telling Mark's college friends that I'd been his nurse before becoming his wife, implying I'd taken advantage of a sick man. She said it with such practiced concern, like she was worried about poor Mark being manipulated. One of his friends, who knew we'd met years before his diagnosis, called her out on the lie. Emma just smiled and said grief made people remember things differently. James cornered me by the coffee station asking about Mark's personal effects, specifically any documents or electronics from his home office. He said it was important for the family business to retrieve certain files. When I told him I hadn't gone through anything yet, his mask slipped for just a second, and I saw panic in his eyes. He quickly recovered, patting my shoulder with false sympathy, saying there was no rush, but the family would need to do an inventory soon. 3 days after the funeral, they called for the reading of the will. Patricia had scheduled it at James's law firm in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbour. She sat at the head of the table like she was holding court. Emma to her right, James standing by the window like he was performing for an audience. They'd brought the old will, the one from 5 years ago that Mark had created right after we married before he knew about their theft. The old will left most everything to the family trust, with provisions for me to remain in the house and receive a modest monthly allowance as long as I didn't remarry. Patricia could barely contain her satisfaction as James read through it. Emma was already making lists on her phone, probably planning which of my belongings she wanted. They didn't notice I wasn't crying, wasn't arguing, wasn't reacting at all. I just sat there thinking about the real will sitting in David's office safe. That night they started their campaign. Patricia had the locks changed on Mark's home office while I was at the funeral home making final arrangements for his headstone. Emma came by with 2 men she claimed were appraisers, but who were actually moving Mark's electronics into a van. When I protested, she said they were family property and showed me a receipt with Patricia's signature as executor. The receipt was dated before Mark died. The next morning, I found my bank accounts frozen. The joint accounts Mark and I shared were suddenly under investigation for irregularities. James sent a letter saying it was standard procedure during estate settlement, but I knew better. They were trying to strangle me financially, force me to bend to their will. My credit cards were cancelled, my name removed from utility accounts. If I hadn't had my own savings account they didn't know about, I would have been completely helpless. Patricia started her social assassination campaign immediately. She told everyone at the country club that I'd been stealing from Mark while he was sick, that they'd found discrepancies in the household accounts. She implied I'd been having an affair with one of the doctors at the hospital, that Mark's death was suspicious timing. The rumors spread through Boston society like wildfire, and suddenly people who'd known me for years were crossing the street to avoid me. 1 week after the funeral, James arrived with an eviction notice. 30 days to vacate the property that belonged to the family trust. He stood in my doorway with 2 security guards as if I was dangerous. He said Patricia was being generous, giving me 30 days that legally they could have me removed immediately. The contempt in his voice was sharp enough to cut glass. My friends from the hospital were my lifeline. Lisa, my colleague from the cardiac unit, immediately offered me her guest room. Other nurses created a meal train, knowing I wasn't eating. They helped me document everything that was happening, taking photos of Emma, removing property recording dates and times of Patricia's harassment. They knew something wasn't right about how the family was behaving. 2 weeks after Mark's death, I finally went to the safety deposit box. The safety deposit box was at a small credit union in Cambridge, the kind of place Patricia would never think to look because it wasn't prestigious enough. My hands shook as I inserted the key and opened the metal door. Inside was an accordion folder, 3 USB drives, and an envelope with my name written in Mark's handwriting. I sat in the private viewing room and started with the letter. Mark's letter was 12 pages long, detailing everything he'd discovered about his family's crimes. His grandmother had created a trust worth $40 million, specifically designed to fund healthcare initiatives and medical research. Patricia had been siphoning money from it for 20 years, using James's legal expertise to hide the transfers. They'd stolen almost $8 million, funding their lifestyles, while blocking the charitable donations his grandmother had mandated. The USB drives contained recordings of James discussing tax fraud with his accountant Patricia, ordering forged documents from someone she'd been blackmailing Emma, filing false insurance claims for jewelry she'd never owned. There were spreadsheets showing the real estate holdings that should have been sold for charity, but were instead generating rental income for Patricia's personal accounts. There were photos of documents with forged signatures, originals, next to the forgeries for comparison. The most shocking discovery was about James's paternity. Mark had found letters between his grandmother and his mother from before James was born. Patricia had been having an affair with her husband's business partner. His grandmother knew James wasn't really her grandson, which is why she'd structured the trust to exclude him, unless he proved himself worthy through charitable work, which he'd never done. Patricia had hidden these letters and created false documentation to ensure James inherited equally. Mark had worked with David to verify everything through forensic accountants and private investigators. They'd built a case that would not only expose the family's crimes, but also invalidate their claims to the estate. The real will, the one Mark had created with David 2 months before he died, left everything to me with specific instructions to liquidate all assets and establish a cardiac research foundation. Patricia and the others were explicitly disinherited, with detailed explanations of why. David's business card was in the folder with a note to call him when I was ready. I called from the credit union parking lot, and he said he'd been waiting for my call. We met at his office that evening after hours for privacy. David had known Mark since law school, had watched Patricia's manipulation for years. He showed me the filed will date, stamped and notarized, completely uncontestable. He also showed me something else. Mark had arranged a lawsuit ready to file against the family for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. We spent the next week preparing everything. I made copies of all the evidence, stored them in different locations, including one with David, one in a safety deposit box at another bank, and encrypted copies in cloud storage. David connected me with a forensic accountant who went through all the financial documents and found even more theft, including Patricia using Mark's social security number to open credit accounts when he was a minor, destroying his credit before he even turned 18. The forensic accountant also discovered that the house I was being evicted from had never been properly transferred to the family trust. Mark's grandmother had placed it in a separate trust specifically for Mark and his heirs, with me named as successor trustee after Mark's death. Patricia had simply acted as if she owned it, paying taxes from the main trust funds and hoping no one would check the actual ownership documents. The deed was still in the grandmother's trust name, and I was now the legal owner. I also discovered Patricia had been intercepting Mark's mail for years, which is a federal crime. There were acceptance letters for speaking engagements. Mark never knew about royalty checks for patents he'd developed that were deposited into accounts he didn't control. Even personal letters from friends Patricia had decided weren't suitable. She'd controlled every aspect of his life she could reach, but she couldn't control me. During this time, the family escalated their harassment. They had utilities shut off at the house, claiming administrative errors. Emma posted on social media about the grief of losing her brother and dealing with gold diggers trying to steal his legacy. James sent threatening letters about litigation if I didn't comply with the eviction. Patricia hired a private investigator to follow me, looking for anything they could use against me. But I was patient, following Mark and David's plan exactly. I documented every harassment, every threat, every lie they told. I had my nurse friends as witnesses to their behavior. I even recorded Patricia when she came to the house uninvited, screaming at me through the door that I'd killed her son with my inferior genetics and working-class stress. She didn't know about the security cameras Mark had installed that captured everything in high definition. The morning before the eviction deadline, I went to the police station and filed reports for harassment, theft, and fraud. The detective was skeptical at first, another rich family squabble, until I showed him the evidence. His entire demeanor changed when he saw the forged documents and heard the recordings. He said this was beyond local jurisdiction, that state and federal authorities would need to be involved. That night, I sat in Mark's favorite chair looking at our wedding photos, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Mark's grandmother's wishes, for the charities that never received their funding, for all the people Patricia had stepped on to maintain her stolen lifestyle. I was fighting for Mark, who'd spent his last months making sure I'd have the weapons to win this war. The morning of my supposed eviction arrived grey and drizzling, perfect weather for what was about to unfold. Patricia arrived at exactly 9 o'clock in her black Mercedes, followed by James in his Porsche and Emma in her Range Rover. They'd brought a moving truck and a crew of 6 men, plus a locksmith. The sheriff was there too, looking bored and ready to get this over with quickly. Several neighbours had gathered on their stoops. Patricia had made sure there would be witnesses to my humiliation. I opened the door before they could knock, dressed professionally in the outfit I wore to court when I had to testify as a medical expert. Patricia smirked, probably thinking I was trying to maintain dignity in defeat. James held up the eviction papers like a trophy. Emma was already directing the movers toward the door, telling them to be careful with the antique furniture that she'd apparently already claimed. The sheriff stepped forward to serve the eviction notice officially, but I held up my hand and presented him with my own folder of documents. His expression changed from bored to confused as he read through them. The first was the deed showing the house was in trust to me. The second was Mark's death certificate, and the trust documents naming me as successor trustee. The third was the new will properly filed and executed. Patricia's face went from smug to confused to pale in about 10 seconds. She snatched the papers from the sheriff's hands, reading them while her perfectly manicured nails dug crescents into the pages. James grabbed them from her, his lawyer brain immediately understanding the implications. Emma just stood there, mouth open, looking between her mother and brother for an explanation. I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings, James's voice filling the morning air, as he discussed hiding assets from the IRS with someone named Bradley. The sheriff's hand moved to his radio. James lunged for my phone, but the sheriff stepped between us. I mentioned casually that copies had already been provided to the district attorney's office and the IRS. The investigation was already underway. Patricia found her voice then screeching about fraud and manipulation and accusing me of forging documents of taking advantage of Mark while he was dying. The neighbours were recording everything on their phones. I remained calm, presenting the sheriff with the forensic accountant's report, showing the family's theft from the grandmother's trust. $8 million, meticulously documented with bank transfers and forged signatures. Emma tried to push past me into the house, claiming her grandmother's jewellery was inside and rightfully hers. I informed her that all the jewellery had been catalogued and was being held as evidence in the fraud investigation. She actually tried to hit me then, swinging her designer purse at my head. The sheriff arrested her for assault, right there on the doorstep with all the neighbours watching. Her mugshot would be on social media within an hour. James threatened to destroy me with litigation, said he'd bury me in legal fees until I begged for mercy. That's when David arrived right on schedule, along with 3 FBI agents and 2 IRS criminal investigators. Apparently, tax fraud and mail fraud across state lines are federal crimes. They had warrants for financial records and electronic devices. James was read his rights, while Patricia stood frozen watching her perfect world crumble. Patricia tried one last manipulation, tears streaming down her face, as she begged me to think of Mark's memory, to not destroy his family like this. She said Mark would be ashamed of me, that he'd never want this. I looked her straight in the eye and told her that Mark had planned every bit of this, that these were his wishes, his evidence, his justice. The shock on her face was worth every moment of pain she'd caused me. The movers who'd been hired to throw my belongings on the street stood awkwardly by their truck. I told them they could leave, but first I hired them on the spot to go to Patricia's house instead and remove any items that had been taken from my home in the past 3 weeks. I had photos and receipts for everything. The sheriff agreed to accompany them to ensure compliance with the court order David had obtained that morning. By noon, the street was empty except for Lisa, who'd come to support me. We sat on the front steps of my house, my legally confirmed house, and watched Patricia's Mercedes being towed as evidence. James's Porsche would be seized as proceeds of crime. Emma was still in custody, being processed for assault and eventually for insurance fraud. The family that had tried to destroy me was falling apart in real time. That evening, the local news ran the story. Prominent Boston family under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The country club that had been Patricia's second home revoked her membership before the 11 o'clock news ended. James's law firm suspended him pending investigation, and by morning they'd fired him and reported him to the Bar Association. Emma's socialite friends disappeared like morning mist, suddenly unable to remember her name when reporters called. The next 3 months were a cascade of consequences for the family that had tormented me for years. The IRS investigation had revealed not just $8 million in stolen charitable funds, but another $4 million in tax evasion spanning 2 decades. They'd been using the grandmother's charitable foundation as a personal piggy bank while filing false tax returns, showing massive donations that never happened. Patricia's house of cards didn't just fall. It exploded. James was the first to be arrested on federal charges. 23 counts of fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. His assets were frozen immediately, including the retirement accounts he'd filled with stolen money. His wife filed for divorce within a week, taking their children and moving to her parents' house in Connecticut. She'd apparently suspected for years, but stayed for the lifestyle. Now she was running to avoid being tainted by association. Emma's situation unraveled when investigators found she'd filed 17 false insurance claims over 5 years, totaling $2.3 million. Fake thefts, staged accidents. Even a counterfeit art piece she claimed was stolen, but had actually never existed. Her ex-husband came forward with evidence that she'd convinced him to participate in insurance fraud during their marriage, then threatened to blame everything on him if he ever talked. He'd been recording their conversations for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. Patricia tried to play the victim, claiming she'd been manipulated by James, that she was just a widow trying to protect her family's legacy. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. Her signature on forged documents, her voice on recordings discussing money transfers, her emails outlining exactly how to hide assets. She'd been the mastermind, using her children as tools while maintaining her image as a grieving widow and society matron. The other relatives started coming forward once they felt safe. Mark's cousin Tony revealed that Patricia had stolen his inheritance, too convincing his father that Tony's social work career meant he didn't deserve family money. An aunt in California had been told her trust fund was depleted, but it had actually been diverted to one of Patricia's accounts. Even the family gardener came forward, revealing that Patricia had been paying him under the table to avoid taxes and threatening his immigration status if he ever complained. I worked with David to liquidate the estate properly, selling the properties that should have been sold years ago, closing the fake charitable accounts, recovering the stolen funds. We established the Mark Foundation for Cardiac Research, funded with $30 million that Patricia had tried to steal. The first grant went to Mass General's cardiac unit, where I'd worked, where Mark had been treated. It would fund free screenings for genetic heart conditions, potentially saving lives of people who couldn't afford testing. Patricia begged me to show mercy, actually showing up at the house one evening looking haggard, without her usual armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup. She offered me $5 million in cash money she'd hidden in offshore accounts if I would drop the charges and let her leave the country. She fell to her knees on my doorstep, the same doorstep where she'd tried to evict me, sobbing about losing everything. I recorded the entire conversation and gave it to the FBI the next morning. The trials were swift and decisive. James was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His law license permanently revoked, his reputation destroyed so thoroughly that even his children changed their last names. Emma got 5 years and had to pay back everything she'd stolen, plus penalties. She'd be released to a world where no one would hire her, marry her, or even acknowledge her existence in the circles she used to rule. Patricia received the harshest sentence, 15 years without possibility of early release. The judge called her betrayal of her mother-in-law's charitable wishes particularly heinous. She'd stolen from medical research that could have saved lives, all to fund a lifestyle built on lies. The courtroom was packed with people she'd hurt over the years, all watching as she was led away in handcuffs. Her empire of manipulation finally ended. I donated most of the money to charity after setting aside enough to live comfortably. The house became a haven for me, and the real family I'd found in my friends from the hospital. We had dinners where laughter filled rooms that had only known judgment. The garden Mark had loved bloomed again without Patricia's rigid control. The neighborhood which had watched my near eviction now waved warmly when I passed, knowing I was the woman who'd stood up to the untouchable Patricia. 6 months after the trials ended, I received a letter from Patricia in prison. I didn't open it, just added it to the box of others she'd sent. James wrote too, still trying to find legal angles, still not understanding that he'd lost. Emma's letters were the saddest rambling apologies, mixed with requests for money, for forgiveness, for me to remember the good times that never existed. I kept them all as reminders of what Mark had protected me from, even in death. A year has passed since that morning they tried to evict me from my own home. The house that Patricia had tried to steal is now filled with warmth and genuine love, something it had been missing for decades. I returned to work at Mass General, but now as Director of Cardiac Nursing, a position funded partly by the Mark Foundation. Every day, I help families facing the same diagnosis that took Mark from me, and I think he would be proud of that legacy. The garden where Mark proposed to me has been transformed into a memorial space, not just for him, but for his grandmother, whose generous spirit Patricia had tried to bury under greed. I had a bench installed where Mark used to sit and watch the sunrise with a plaque that reads, "Love is not about what you leave behind, but about empowering those you leave to stand tall." His cousin Tony helped design it, and we often sit there together sharing stories about the Mark that his family never wanted to see. I've been in therapy working through not just the grief of losing Mark, but the trauma of what his family put us through. My therapist says I show remarkable resilience, but I know it's not my strength alone. It's Mark's foresight, his determination to protect me, his love that transcended death itself. Every victory in that courtroom was his victory. Every moment of justice was his gift to me. The Foundation has already funded 3 major research projects and provided free cardiac screenings to over 10,000 people who couldn't afford them. One of those screenings detected a condition in a young father of 3, saving his life. His family sent me a card with a photo of his children, and I keep it on my desk next to Mark's picture. This is what Patricia tried to steal, not just money, but the possibility of saved lives, of families kept whole. I've started speaking at legal conferences about estate fraud and family financial abuse, sharing our story to help others protect themselves. The calls I get from people in similar situations break my heart, but also strengthen my resolve. Mark's story has become a cautionary tale in legal textbooks, a case study in how love and preparation can triumph over greed and cruelty. Harvard Law, where James once guest lectured, now uses his prosecution as an example of ethical failures in estate law. Dating isn't on my radar yet, and may never be. Mark was my person, my partner, my best friend. But I'm not closed to the future either. I've learned that life can surprise you, that strength can come from unexpected places, that love can protect you even after it's gone. If someone comes along who understands that I'm not broken but rebuilt, who sees the scars as proof of survival rather than damage, then maybe. But for now, I'm content with the life Mark helped me build from the ashes of his family's cruelty. The house is often filled with friends, now colleagues from the hospital, people from the foundation, neighbors who've become like family. We have monthly dinners where we share stories, laugh until our sides hurt, and toast to second chances. Mark's favorite wine, the one Patricia said was too common for the family cellar, is always on the table. These gatherings would horrify Patricia with their genuine joy, their lack of pretense, their celebration of real connection over social status. Sometimes I think about the letters Patricia sends from prison unopened and unread in their box in the basement. Maybe one day I'll read them. Maybe I'll burn them. Or maybe they'll stay sealed forever. A monument to the irrelevance of her words. She has no power over me anymore, no ability to hurt or manipulate. The woman who thought she could erase me from existence is now the one who's been erased, reduced to a number in a federal prison, forgotten by the society she fought so hard to impress. The irony isn't lost on me that in trying to destroy me, Patricia handed me everything, not just the money or the house, but freedom from their toxic influence, validation of my marriage to Mark, proof that I was truly loved. She gave me the opportunity to honor both Mark and his grandmother's legacy in ways they never could have imagined. Her greed became my strength. Her cruelty became my catalyst for justice. I've kept one recording of Mark's voice on my phone. Not one of the evidence recordings, but a voicemail he left me during one of his hospital stays. He's telling me about a terrible joke his nurse told him, laughing despite the pain, ending with, "I love you, Caroline, always." It's a reminder that while Patricia tried to reduce our marriage to transactions and inheritances, what we had was real, beautiful, and ultimately indestructible. The greatest lesson I've learned through all of this is that family isn't about blood or names or inheritance. It's about who shows up when your world falls apart, who fights beside you when you're outnumbered, who celebrates your victories and mourns your losses as their own. Mark knew this, which is why he spent his final months ensuring I'd have the tools to fight back. He didn't just leave me money or property, he left me proof that I was valued, protected, and deeply loved. Sometimes the greatest gift our loved ones leave us isn't material wealth, but the courage to stand up for ourselves and the evidence that we were truly, completely, unconditionally loved. Mark's final act of love wasn't just dying peacefully in my arms. It was ensuring that his family could never hurt me again, that their cruelty would become their downfall, that I would emerge not as a victim, but as a victor. To anyone watching who's dealing with family manipulation, financial abuse, or threats to their inheritance, please know that documentation is your weapon. Preparation is your shield, and truth will eventually prevail. Don't let them silence you with their wealth or status. Mark taught me that real power isn't in money or family names, but in truth, evidence, and the courage to use both. What would you do if your spouse's family tried to destroy you after their death? Have you ever had to stand up to powerful people who thought they were untouchable? Share your stories in the comments below, because sometimes knowing we're not alone is the first step toward justice. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more about triumph over adversity. And please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they're not powerless, that love can protect us even from beyond, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply revealing the truth. Thank you for listening to my story, Mark's story. Our story of how love conquered greed, how preparation defeated manipulation, and how a nurse from Worcester brought down a Boston dynasty that thought they were untouchable. Remember, you are stronger than you know, especially when you're fighting for someone you love. Stay strong, document everything, and never let them convince you that you don't deserve justice. Until next time, this is Caroline reminding you that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, but the courage to fight for what's right.